I would like to encourage people to fill out cards if you have questions. I'm going to start and go back with to David and ask actually each of you, given that charter schools are here to stay. I mean, there are almost 80% of schools in New Orleans.
Yes.
They're over 50% in Detroit.
Yes.
They're over 40% in DC. And a few of them are really very good.
A few.
A few, yeah. I mean, some of them are average, and some of them are very good, and some of them are pretty bad. But, you know, given the state that we're in and the politics of where we are, the fact is that we're good. They're going to be here. They're going to be here, and especially in urban areas. So, given that reality, what policies could you envision to help the situation, to make both public and charters more greater excellence and more financially viable? And I know that we missed those slides from David, so I thought maybe we could start there.
I don't know where your slides.
Yeah, that's all right.
There was the suggested policies.
Sure. So, my comments were probably at a higher level.
Okay.
Than, no. I'm happy to take the offer. I would just say that I was intrigued and interested in some of the discussions here about how to manage the coexistence of the two systems with finances. But I want to take a step back to some basic things, because there's terrific variation across states in the accountability of these charter schools. Maybe I should have stressed it more. We have a really unregulated system in Michigan. And so right at the first, I mean, it's important that the charters be publicly accountable, and that there's clear lines of authority over them. And I think it has to fall to the authorizers, and the authorizers themselves have to be publicly accountable. And I would say at a minimum, I mean, we have a system in Michigan. What happened? I would just say in passing, I was never an opponent. I'll just say early on, I wasn't an opponent to having if you're going to have charters, have for-profit management company. It didn't strike me as necessarily terrible. I don't say that anymore. Because the having the for-profit management companies really sort of changes the dynamic. They become very forceful players in limiting the accountability provisions that might be established. I'd say at a minimum, you should have the authorizers subject to the guidelines of the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. That's just a baseline, and we don't do that in Michigan. Secondly, you have to get rid of these financial incentives, right? You get the monies the state revenues have to match up with the costs that are and address the transitional issues that the other speakers have talked here. I would just say finally, given the world we have in places like Detroit, where right now more kids are going to charters than are going to districts, and politically, the strategy of just sort of saying get rid of those charters and make it all a single district. There are people that want that. I would be in favor of it. Honestly, I won't defend it now. But the prospect of moving to a system in which the district is gone and it's only charters is actually a stronger political possibility. So I say in that world, it's a step forward to establish these administrative structures that oversee both the district and charter schools. Try over time, because the opponents of the public schools are going to fight that. Betsy DeVos will fight that. She fought it in Michigan and she won.
Yes.
Against the Republicans, against the Detroit Chamber, against all these forces, she won. They wanted a Detroit Education Commission. I say that's worth fighting for. Okay? the New Orleans thing, because once you get it, then you can begin expanding the kinds of responsibilities and functions that are placed there. And I'll say one of the reasons it didn't happen in Michigan, it wasn't just the DeVos family and their funds, it was the financial institutions that backed the for-profit management companies that were extremely important in killing that proposal, because they felt that unlike the current system where they had captured the authorizers, they could no longer count on their control over where and when they could open their schools once it turned to a public agency like that. So I think this is a turf for those places where you have a lot of charters that have gone, it's unregulated, that these are things worth struggling over.
Bruce?
Yeah, I agree that, one of the main issues is that we need accepting that we now have these dual systems, and we have these dual systems operating in common spaces, that we have to have some centralized, truly public entity, government entity that is directly responsible for the accountability of that system as a whole, that is looking out for, kind of going back to my first point on that first slide, that's looking out for whether or not the system as a whole serving this common space is working in the aggregate in the best interests of all children in that space. That if we're going to have these two systems, we need to have some consistent oversight. We need to have the same levels of financial transparency for both the district and charter schools. Again, drawing on my experience working with the Maryland data, the level of comparability and precision of data that we had access to in Maryland was so much better than I've had anywhere else. The data we can get on details of charter school finances in New Jersey are complete garbage. In many other places, we have so little ability to really tease out what's going on with these public dollars once transferred to the private management entity. Or even to what extent are those transferred, and what are the comparable expenditures between the district and charter schools? What degrees of equity do we even have? We need some centralized governance of that. We need some centralized control over and management of the capital assets. We need to maintain those capital assets to serve the public good, the assets that the public has invested in over decades to serve the public good, including space that might be used by charter schools. That's another centralized obligation. Even in this transition period, I also argue in my Economic Policy Institute report that we need to maintain a centralized responsibility for covering those, what are referred to by some as legacy debts, such as the pension obligations of the teachers from the system that's been reduced in scale. The fact that in Detroit, we've now permitted the transition of a large share of students in an overall declining population to move from one system to another doesn't dissolve the overall obligation to cover the pension, those pension obligations to the teachers that were in Detroit. And it shouldn't just fall on what's left of the Detroit public schools. That's a centralized obligation. That's an obligation of the system as a whole that has to be covered by some centrally public, like legit public governing entity. And the reason I keep saying kind of legit public governing entity is that we also then have to be equally protecting the constitutional and state statutory and U.S. constitutional, state statutory, state constitutional rights of kids, taxpayers, employees who are in this system serving these public interests. And Preston Green and Joseph Olawole and I write extensively about the fact that that at least regarding employee and student rights, because a lot it cannot simply be assumed about those rights. It has to be explicit in state charter school laws. We have to have action around guaranteeing due process rights for employees, that speech rights, maybe they're protected under whistleblower laws separately, but that there are speech rights that an employee in a charter school whose contract is with a private management company as opposed to a government still has First Amendment protections by declaring it as such in state statute. because it otherwise doesn't exist, says at least one federal case out of Arizona. And the same for student rights under discipline policies. We have to simply declare that kids who attend these schools are going to have the same rights as kids who attend any other schools if we're going to accept that this is part of the publicly funded system of schooling to serve the interests of kids. Otherwise, if we don't declare that, then we're accepting the disproportionate deprivation of constitutional rights to be borne by low-income and minority kids. Something we wouldn't, the suburbs just would not accept that, for 1 minute. So we've got to have those things laid out explicitly. We've got to have central governance. We've got to protect our capital assets. I'm going to pass the ball from that point.
Pass.
Okay, this question I think probably is for Randall, given your research on school health centers. So the loss to the environment when non-neighborhood charters require lots of driving was brought up by in one question. What is the loss of social capital when neighborhood schools largely disappear? Is there any research on this? And is it an especially damaging issue in the lowest income neighborhoods?
I wasn't the one who brought up the capital, but the exercise, I think Bruce did, right?
I brought that part up, but I think we can kind of bounce around these other issues of what happens when we close
Yeah.
district schools vastly across neighborhoods, be it Chicago or Philly or whatever. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think just one quick note on that is that, of course, neighborhood schools are also a way that parents get to know one another, and literally it's an important social meeting point and organization point for the neighborhood. Of course, the complete loss of neighborhood schools has mostly happened in places where you've had special districts, like in New Orleans, take over.
Well, can I?
Yeah. You want to go next?
Yeah, I want to point out that it's kind of interesting that most of this is just happening in inner city neighborhoods, and I want to stay focused on that. And the fact that we lose community, the child loses sense of community because they're on the bus early in the morning and on the bus coming back home late in the evening. And so there's a whole lot of social capital that's lost on the child, and the sense of belonging, the sense of feeling good about its own identity. So I think there are lots of, this is not based on a study, this is just based on my speculation that that's what's happening. And New Orleans took advantage of the hurricane, Detroit took advantage of DeBose, and everywhere we have these large charter school takeovers, I still say it's for profiteering. You can't get around it.
So much of it comes down to this, that there's often this argument made, well, how could we do worse, right? Which, there's this assumption in kind of reform.
Come to Detroit.
Exactly.
Go to
Right.
Detroit.
There's this reform community assertion that I've had a number of blog posts on this. Well, the status quo is so awful that I get accused
Yeah.
of being I'm a supporter of the status quo, right? Well, sometimes the status quo is better than the alternative, and we. There's a lot of kind of political rhetoric that tries to kind of capitalize on that just despair over the quality of the status quo, and the assertion that no matter what we do, it couldn't be worse. And the reality is that it can be worse. Detroit is a really good example of how it can be worse, especially when we kind of combine the context of what was going on in Detroit with a Michigan-wide kind of policy preference for that somehow choice can be a substitute for equitable and adequate funding. When clearly it can't, and by having a less well-funded system with lots more choices over time, what you get is what I said before, a whole bunch of really crappy choices. That's a worse system. Going back to this transportation, there are some really nice pieces through Doug Harris and his group in New Orleans that kind of outline transportation times, transportation costs of the New Orleans model. I think there was a recent study on transportation times in D.C. And, you know, we haven't, and I'm sure there's actually, I think there are some people out there looking more at the sociological side of how this relates to kind of neighborhood and social coherence and social networking. These disruptions, sadly, we don't have them on the panel, and I'm not equipped to speak well about that here. But going back to this whole kind of status quo thing, of course, one of the reasons why this argument about choice emerges is because when we start talking about neighborhoods and neighborhood schools as an alternative, we all realize that neighborhoods were in urban areas were very much built themselves around racial and as a result economic segregation, which stemmed mainly from race-based policies. So we constructed a system of based on residential location that was vastly disparate on the basis of race. So those who would wish to promote choice as an alternative will say, well, but racial segregation and unequal quality of neighborhoods is just as bad, if not worse, so we ought to let those kids choose to go across the line that they weren't allowed to go across before. Again, I take this angle that, you know, one, they're talking about choice as a substitute for actually trying to make all systems better.
And
So
not all choice is good choice.
And not all choice is good choice. And I think we can acknowledge the problems with the racial segregation and continued racial discrimination in lending and related to housing, real estate practices across the board. We can acknowledge the problems and inequities that arise from location-based schooling without having to accept that somehow, you know, choice is the only solution to that.
Two questions for Alice. One is starts with thank you, and wants to know is at this point is it really feasible to think that we can go back to a solely traditional system? There's another question from a teacher who said that I've worked in good charters and bad charters. The good charter was what you describe as ideal: certified teachers, accountability to results, open access to all kids, etc. Given this, what would you need to support this type of high-performing school?
Well, I would support any school that is a quality school, that's regulated, that has standards that we all have known and come to love and believe in, and that can be held accountable. As I said, I think the genie is out of the bottle. We can't get rid of the charter schools, but we can regulate them. From the time we've been going around the country doing this study, we've seen some improvements in the charter school industry, at least in California, because we make a lot of noise because we're out there. But you don't find many charter school operators now bragging about the fact that they're not regulated, that they're not transparent. They're not public. And on top of that, a lot of these operating management systems are exploiting our people because they know how bad public education, traditional education has been in the inner city. This is where I get mad at my teachers' unions because I think you could have done something about it. And what they're doing now is that they are coming in and they're taking these black parents who are distraught because they want the same for their children that you want for your children. And they don't know how to get it. And so they're coming in and they're finding these people who care. Now that they can get black operators to be fronts for these schools that are set up for these companies that are for profit, then it makes it very hard to talk about it in racial terms because you got black operators who will come up and say now, oh, are you opposed to me educating my own child? Well, it's resegregation of the school system, number one. Everything that we fought for is going back and not forward. And the fact that they're exploiting these people and they got their hearts on the line because they think they're doing a good job, well, it's some of these schools that they don't have the skills to run a public education school system. There are a few good charters, I say that, whoever asked the question, but you can't sacrifice the majority for a few. And if you're just gonna say, well, we got a few good ones and let's just keep going forward, what about all my little children, black and brown and poor white kids, that are not getting the quality education they deserve because they're in the schools of last resort? How about the public school, the charter schools that won't take most special ed kids? That's what we found. We went to New Orleans, whoever is talking about New Orleans, the kids stood up. They thought we were there to support charter schools, and they were angry with us. And they wanted us to know that schools had closed. They couldn't get the records. They couldn't graduate. They couldn't get the class from, say you were taking Spanish in the 9th grade, you got to the 10th grade, in charter schools, you didn't have Spanish. You had to start over something else. It was so many horror stories in New Orleans that we almost had to call in security to get out of there alive. And so we can't afford in this country to just forego the whole for a small little part over here that's doing well. We have an obligation to educate to give every child the opportunity. We can't educate them if they don't want the education. You want to blame the parents because they're not as diligent in monitoring the schools as they are in the suburbs, but you got to understand that there's a whole base of poverty, and people don't have the same skills. They don't know how to advocate. A lot of school systems intimidate them, and they haven't gone through the system themselves. They're dropouts. So there are lots of problems in the inner city area that I don't ignore, but I think collectively we have the skills to do something about them. So no, we won't get rid of charter schools, but we sure can regulate them. And we sure can stop them from expanding, because you got too many authorizing entities, too many. There's so many authorizing entities that you couldn't possibly hold them accountable. And even the authorizing entities can't hold them accountable because they don't know why they authorized them. But we do know that if you can't put the genie back in the bottle, you can sure fix up what's going on. We have the capacity to make them better, to make the whole system better. So holding the charter schools accountable will make them better. And then looking at what's happening in the traditional schools, how about some choice over there? How about some choice in traditional schools? How about changing, I don't now talk about all public schools being bad the way I used to. And you can say I have a big mouth, so I did it for a long time. But now I realize that when you do that, you condemn the whole system, instead of taking the parts of the system that's working and trying to impose them on the part of the system that's not working.
I'm going to have time, I think, just for one more question. What conditions hinder or facilitate moving towards a more cohesive system, or the dual systems that we have now? And is it possible to move in that direction in the climate of competition that we have? For anybody.
I think that we've talked a little bit about the incentives and the measures and the focus on competition, right? Because like I pointed out in all these studies that we do or that get put out, it's about, did the charters beat the district schools, or did the district schools beat the charters? And part of the incentive there is, well, it's easier to win, like I said before, easier to win against a weaker opponent. And even in research design, it's your counterfactual. We don't consider that, well, okay, we might have some Detroit charter schools that got better test scores and they had a widening gap on test scores than district schools over time. Well, that's because we kept making the district schools more and more deprived and worse and worse. That was not good for the whole. We have studies of Newark charter schools, and then they advertise on that basis. In fact, I heard a really cool NPR clip on my way down this morning. It was someone from outside of education who was writing about education, and one of their last points was on that about whether or not choice and chartering could help make the system as a whole better. And they said the same thing: to the extent that we are focusing on test score metrics and competition to have better test scores as the marketing basis and everything else, that's what encourages charters to be recruiting the kids who are going to get better test scores. That's what encourages this competition about, well, I can get better test scores if I can make sure they don't. And this is the design of the system. I talked to one in Newark. it's basically in the city of Newark, it's like a 3-district system. You got the district, you've got Team Academy, which is a very large KIPP affiliated network, but its existence predates KIPP. It merges with KIPP later on, and then North Star Academy, which is part of Uncommon Schools. North Star Academy takes the very extreme approach of getting the best test scores they can while serving the population that's going to get them those scores, and having just ridiculously high attrition rates among those students who will not. Team Academy tries to walk the middle ground much more, and very early on in this process, I remember having a side conversation with the then head of Team Academy, who would talk about how his own board of directors would constantly be putting pressure on him to produce the kinds of test scores that North Star was, right? Because that's the incentive, to be able to get the news story that says this urban school district got the same test scores as this suburban district, that this is what we put out there on our posters to get kids to choose us, to be on our waiting list instead of theirs. And until we change those incentives, and until we change the metrics that drive those incentives, it won't be a collaborative environment.
David.
Thanks. I'm going to pose just a little bit different angle here. It's refreshing to come to Washington, D.C. from Michigan to hear these conversations about incentives and way to fine-tune these things. I embrace the spirit of it. But I'm going to say that if the question is, what are the barriers to this kind of partnership? The main barriers are not having smart people think up better ways of doing it. You've heard a bunch of ideas here. And the circumstances vary terrifically across states, okay? But I want to say, from where I'm coming from, the key barrier is not from people who are driven by profiteering. Right? It's driven by people who really do want to move education out of the traditional system,
Oh, well, that's
right? That is the goal. There will be conversation about raising test scores and opportunity, but these are folks, it's a small set. This is not representative nationally, but a small set of very influential people who understand from their own experiences that the key opposition to them in state legislation elsewhere are organized interests. They're interested in moving the provision of education services away from traditional districts because that's where unions are organized, that's where the decisions are governed by by local boards, and that is not going to change. The test score examples are not going to change that. I wish I could say this differently, but after a quarter century of watching this kind of drama in my own home state, I fear that it's being exported elsewhere. I don't think these decisions are going to be changed. Although I'll continue to try. I'll continue to write about these. So it's really. I think in the end it'll have to rely on galvanizing political support for public schools.
I have to ask a question. Why this small group of people that you're talking about, what's their motive?
Public schools and the groups that are organized through that system are the most formidable obstacle for controlling politics more generally on things that they care about.
Randall, you have the last word. I saw you.
So, I think we have to be careful because there's also a lot of venom on the other side to the debate. You know, casting, are you pro-charter or anti-charter becomes this extreme thing. You're either on one side or another. An optimistic note could be maybe it won't happen at the national level anytime soon, but at the local level, this is sort of jumping on what Bruce was saying and what Alice was saying about reporting out of, you know, successful charter examples, charters as laboratories of learning where there's reporting out. It'd be refreshing to hear local political leaders simultaneously talk about the performance of charters in traditional public schools. There's no reason not to. If we truly do consider charter schools part of the public system and that they're both public schools, the more the reporting matters and the way you talk about it matters, and simultaneously talk about how both varieties of public schools are doing.
I take that point, I think it's a good point, and I would just say that in an extreme setting like Michigan, the labor unions, the traditional actors in the traditional system are willing to cooperate. They want to cooperate. They want to define rules for a joint system. The reason it's not happening is not them.
Thank you to the panel. Please give them a round of applause. And I'm sure that they'll be here if you want to speak with them more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.